A Good Cigar is a Smoke by P.G. Wodehouse. When Lancelot Bingley, the rising young artist, became engaged to Gladys Weatherby, the poetess, who, in addition to her skill with the pen, had the face and figure of the better type of pin-up girl, and eyes of about the colour of the Mediterranean on a good day, he naturally felt that this was a good thing, and one that should be pushed along. The sooner the wedding took place, in his opinion, the better it would be for all concerned. He broached the subject to her as they were tucking into the poulet rôti au cresson one evening at the Crushed Pansy, the restaurant with a soul. "What I would suggest," he said, "if you haven't anything special on next week, is that we toddle round to the registrar's and encourage him to do his stuff. They tell me these registrar fellows make a very quick job of it. The whole thing wouldn't take more than 10 minutes or so, and there we would be, with it off our minds, if you see what I mean." To his consternation, instead of clapping her hands in girlish glee and telling him that he had struck the right note there, she shook her head. "I'm afraid it's not so simple as that." "What's your problem?" "I was thinking of Uncle Francis." "Who's Uncle Francis?" "My Uncle Francis." "I didn't know you had an Uncle Francis." "He was my mother's brother, Colonel Pashley Drake. You've probably heard of him." "Not a word. Nobody tells me anything." "He used to be a famous big game hunter." Lancelot frowned. He was not fond of big game hunters. His own impulse, if he had met a wapiti or a gnu or whatever it might be, would have been to offer it a ham sandwich from his luncheon-basket, and the idea of plucking it with a repeating rifle, as this Pashley Drake presumably did, revolted him. "I'm not sorry we never ran across each other then. I wouldn't have liked him." "Mother did. She looked up to him very much, and when she died she left him a chunk of money, which he was to hand over to me when I married." "Excellent." "Not so excellent, because I am only to get it if he approves of the man I want to marry, and he won't approve of you." "Why not?" "You're an artist." "What's wrong with artists?" "Uncle Francis thinks they spend all their time having orgies in studios and painting foreign princesses sitting on leopard skins in the nude." "Uncle Francis is a fathead." "Very true, but he's the one who controls the cash." "And you feel he won't part?" "The betting's against it." "Then let's do without it. I've plenty," said Lancelot, who was more fortunate than most artists in having a nice private income. Gladys shook her head. It seemed to him that she was always shaking her head tonight. "No," she said, "I need that money, and I won't get married without it. I'm not going to be one of those pauper wives who have to come and plead brokenly with their husbands every time they want the price of a new hat. Some of my married friends tell me it sometimes takes half a pint of tears before their mate can be induced to disgorge the most trifling sum. I couldn't do it. My pride forbids it." And though Lancelot argued eloquently with her all through the poulet rôti au cresson course, and later during the after-dinner coffee, she was not to be moved from her decision. It was a gloomy young rising artist who saw her home, and then went off and got plastered in a series of pubs. What, he was asking himself, would the harvest be, and where did he go from here? He tried to tell himself that this was a mere whim on her part, but the theory brought him little consolation. He knew only too well that she had a whim of iron. His hangover on the following day precluded for a space all thought of anything except bicarbonate of soda, but even when several beakers of the refreshing fluid had built him up physically, he was no nearer to being his customary carefree self. for anguish and despair took over, and he sat brooding and listless in his studio, incapable of putting brush to canvas. If a nude princess had looked in, wanting her portrait painted, he would have refused the commission without hesitation, pleading in excuse that he was not in the mood. All he could do in the way of alleviating the agony that seared his soul was to play the accordion, always his solace in times of stress, and he had worked his way through Over the Rainbow and was preparing to tackle Old Man River, when the door flew open and Gladys bounded in, her manner animated and eyes shining, it seemed to him from a quick glance, like twin stars. "Put away that stomach Steinway, my Prince Charming," she cried, "and listen to me, for I bring news that will make you go dancing about London like a nautch girl. Guess what arrived by the morning post? A letter from Uncle Francis." Lancelot was unable to see why this should be considered a cause for rejoicing. "Oh, yes," he said, not attempting to share her enthusiasm. "And what do you think he was writing about? He asked me to find him an artist to paint his portrait, to be presented to the Explorers Club. You get the job." Lancelot blinked, still unenthusiastic. His head had begun to pain him again, and he could imagine nothing less agreeable than painting the portrait of a big game hunter who would probably want to be portrayed with a gun in his hand and a solar topee on his head, standing with one foot on a stuffed antelope. "Me?" he said. "Why me? Don't you see what this means? You'll be closeted with him day after day, and if you can't fascinate him under those conditions, you're not the king among men I've always thought you. By the end of a couple of weeks, you'll have got him so that he can deny you nothing. You then tell him we're going to get married, and he gives you his blessing and reaches for his fountain pen and cheque-book. Any questions?" Lancelot's listlessness fell from him like a garment. Even though his mind was working slowly this morning, he was able to see the merits of the scheme. "None," he said. "It's terrific." "I knew you'd think so." But a thought had occurred to Lancelot. As an artist, he belonged to the ultra-modern school, expressing himself most readily in pictures showing a sardine tin, 2 empty beer bottles, a bunch of carrots, and a dead cat, the whole intended to represent Paris in springtime. He doubted his ability to work in another vein. "Would I be any good at a portrait?" "Good enough for a gaggle of explorers. All explorers have weak eyes through staring at the sunrise on the lower Zambesi. They won't notice a thing." "Well, if you say so, then what's the drill?" "Uncle Francis has a house down at Bittleton in Sussex. You go there tomorrow with your paints and brushes. I'll phone him to be expecting you." Another thought struck Lancelot. "I suppose I'm in for a thin time as regards meals. Don't big hunters live on pemmican and native maize and that sort of thing?" "Uncle Francis doesn't. He has the most sensational cook. Every dish a poem." "That sounds all right," said Lancelot, brightening. Being an artist, he usually made do of an evening with the knuckle end of a ham or something out of a tin, but he was by no means incapable of appreciating good cooking, and had often wished, when at the Crushed Pansy, that the poulet rôti au cresson had been a bit better rôti. "I go tomorrow, you say?" "Better perhaps the day after tomorrow. That'll give you time to mug up Uncle Francis's book, My Life with Rod and Gun, so that you can draw him out about the things he used to shoot. He gave me a copy at Christmas, when I was expecting at least a wristwatch." "That's how it goes," said Lancelot sympathetically. "Yes, that's life," Gladys agreed. "And the best offer I got from the second-hand bookshop was threepence, so the volume is still on my shelves. You can come and fetch it this afternoon." "And I leave the day after tomorrow." "That's right, and I'll come and see you off at the station." As Lancelot sat in his compartment, waiting for the train to start, and gazing at Gladys, who was standing on the platform, he was thinking how much he loved her, and what a dreadful thought it was that they were to be separated like this for who knew how long. He was to learn almost immediately that there were other dreadful thoughts going around. She now gave utterance to one of them. "Oh, by the way, Angel," she said, "there's one other thing I almost forgot to tell you. Uncle Francis is rabidly opposed to smoking." "He is?" said Lancelot, feeling that the more he heard of this uncle of hers, the less attractive a character he appeared to be. "So, of course, you'll have to knock it off for the duration." A strong shudder shook Lancelot. He was a heavy smoker, in spite of having two aunts who belonged to the Anti-Tobacco League, and kept sending him pamphlets showing how disastrous for the health the practice was. His jaw fell a couple of notches, and he stared at her incredulously. "Knock off smoking?" he gasped, wondering if he could have heard her correctly. "That's right." "For weeks and weeks? I couldn't." "You couldn't, eh?" "No, I couldn't." "Well, you'd jolly well better, or—" "Or what?" "Else," said Gladys, and the train moved off. It was one of those trains that have not become attuned to the modern spirit of speed and hustle, and as it sauntered through the sunlit countryside, Lancelot had ample opportunity to turn over Gladys's parting words in his mind and examine them. And the more he did so, the less he liked the sound of them. Nor is this surprising. There are probably no words in the language which a lover more dislikes to hear on the lips of his loved one than those two words, "or else." They have a sinister ring, calculated to chill the hardiest. He mused. One cannot say that he was standing at a man's crossroads, for he was sitting, but it was plain to him that he was confronted with the most serious dilemma of his lifetime. If, on the one hand, he obeyed her behest and refrained from smoking, every nerve in his body would soon be sticking out and starting to curl at the ends, and the softest chirrup of the early bird attending to its worm outside his window would send him shooting up to the ceiling as if some fun-loving practical joker had exploded a bomb beneath his bed. He had once knocked off smoking for 2 or 3 days, and he knew what it was like. If, however, on the other hand, he took a strong line and stoutly refused to keep away from the box of 50 excellent cigars which he had brought with him, what then? He knew very well what then. There would be for him no wedding bells, or whatever registrars substitute for them. Gladys was, as nearly as made no matter, an angel in human shape. But she was inclined, like so many girls who have what it takes, to be imperious and of a trend of mind to resent hotly anything in the nature of what might be called funny business. And that she would class as funny business a deliberate flouting of her orders was sickeningly clear to him. She would return the ring, his letters, and what was left of the bottle of scent he had given her on her birthday, within minutes of learning of his disobedience. There flitted into his mind an insidious line from an old poem of Rudyard Kipling's. "A woman is only a woman," it ran, "but a good cigar is a smoke." And for one awful moment he found himself feeling that Mr. Kipling had said a mouthful. Then he remembered Gladys's star-like eyes, her slender figure, and the little freckle on the tip of her nose, and was strong again. It was with the resolve that, however great his sufferings, he would retain her love that he alighted at Bittleton station, and a short time later was meeting the man whose rugged features he was about to record on canvas. They were features, particularly the 3 chins, of an undisguised opulence, and his body was in keeping with his face. Colonel Pashley Drake was, in short, a stout man. Indeed, the thought flashed through Lancelot's mind that if he wanted to have himself painted full length, it would be necessary to send back to London for a larger canvas than any that he had brought with him. He knew from reading My Life with Rod and Gun that the colonel, when hunting big game, had frequently hidden behind a tree. To conceal him in this, the evening of his life, only a Californian redwood would have served. And when later they sat together at the dinner table, he got an inkling as to how this obesity had come about. The dinner was a long one, and in every respect superb. It was plain to Lancelot, from the first spoonful of soup that Gladys had well described his host's cook. The fish confirmed his view that she was a cook in 1,000. He mentioned this to the colonel, and the latter, a look of holy ecstasy in his eye, agreed that Mrs. Potter, for such was the gifted woman's name, was at the very head of her profession. After that he did not speak very much, being otherwise occupied. Coffee, after the meal, was served in a study or library, a large room tastefully decorated with the heads of various fauna which had had the misfortune to meet the other when he was out with his gun. As they seated themselves, the colonel wheezed apologetically. "I am afraid I cannot offer you a cigar," he said, and Lancelot raised a deprecating hand. "Had you done so," he assured him, "I should have been obliged to decline it, with thanks, of course, for the kind thought. I do not smoke." "Smoking," said Lancelot, remembering a pamphlet sent to him by one of his aunts, "causes nervous dyspepsia, sleeplessness, headache, weak eyes, asthma, bronchitis, neurasthenia, rheumatism, lumbago, sciatica, loss of memory, falling out of hair, and red spots on the skin. I wouldn't smoke so much as a cigarette to please a dying grandfather. My friends often rally me on what they consider my finicky objection to having red spots on my skin, but I remain firm." "You are very sensible," said Colonel Pashley Drake, with such obvious approval that Lancelot felt that the task of fascinating him would prove even easier than Gladys had predicted. He looked forward to the moment, at no distant date, when he would have the old buster rolling on the floor with paws in the air like a tickled dachshund. The love feast became intensified as the time went on. The colonel was plainly delighted that Lancelot had derived such pleasure from his little book, and spoke fluently and well on the subject of tigers he had met, and what to do when confronted with a charging rhinoceros, together with many an anecdote about the selected portions of gnus, giraffes, and the like, which ornamented the walls. At long last he stifled a yawn, and said he thought he would be turning in, and they parted in an atmosphere of the utmost cordiality. The dinner, as has been said, had been a long and heavy one, and it had left Lancelot with a feeling of repletion which only fresh air could relieve. And before going to bed he felt the prudent thing to do was to take a half-hour's stroll in the garden. He proceeded to do so, and what with the beauty of the night and the thinking of long, loving thoughts of Gladys, he exceeded the estimated time by a wide margin. It was some 2 hours later when the advisability of going to bed presented itself, and he made his way back to the house. only to discover when he reached it that in his absence some hidden hand had locked the front door. It was a blow which might have crushed a weaker man, but Lancelot was resourceful, and the idea of trying the back door occurred to him almost immediately. He found that, too, securely fastened, and it became evident that unless he was prepared to pass the remainder of the night in the open, it would be necessary to break a window. This, as noiselessly as possible, he did, and climbing through, found himself in what, from the smell, he took to be the kitchen. And he was about to grope in the darkness in the hope of finding the door, when a voice spoke, a harsh, guttural voice, which jarred unpleasantly on his sensitive ear, though the most musical voice speaking at that moment would equally have given him the illusion that the top of his head had parted from its moorings. It said rather curtly, "Who are you?" Suavity, Lancelot felt, was what he must strive for. "It's quite all right," he said obsequiously. "I was locked out." "Who are you?" "My name is Lancelot Bingley. I am staying in the house. I am an artist. I am here to paint Colonel Pashley Drake's portrait. I would not advise waking him now, but if you inquire of him in the morning, he will support my statement." "Who are you?" Annoyance began to compete with Lancelot's embarrassment. If voices asked you questions, he felt they might at least take the trouble to listen to you when you answered them. His manner took on a stiffness. "I have already informed you, in a perfectly frank manner, that my name is Lancelot Bingley, and that I am staying in the house in order to paint—" "Have a nut," said the voice, changing the subject. Lancelot's teeth came together with a sharp click. Few things are more mortifying to a proud man than the discovery that he had been wasting his time being respectful to a parrot, and he burned with resentment and pique. Ignoring the bird's suggestion, in the circumstances ill-timed and lacking in taste, that he should scratch its head, he continued groping for the door, and eventually found it. After that, everything was simple. Bounding silently up the stairs, he flung open the door of his room, and not bothering to turn on the light, flung himself on the bed. Or rather, not precisely on the bed, but on some squashy substance inside it, which proved on investigation to be Colonel Pashley Drake. Pardonably a little overwrought by his recent exchange of ideas with the parrot, he had mistaken the colonel's room, first to the left along the corridor, for his own, which he now remembered was the second on the left along the corridor. He lost no time in climbing off his host's stomach, on which he rightly supposed he had been nestling, but it was too late. The mischief had been done. The colonel was plainly emotionally disturbed. He soliloquized for some moments in some native dialect which was strange to Lancelot. "What the devil?" he inquired at length, dropping into English. Inspiration descended on Lancelot. "I came to ask you about the portrait. I was wondering if you wanted it full length or just head and shoulders," he said, prudently omitting to explain why such a speculation was needed. His roommate quivered, like someone doing one of the modern dances. "You woke me at this time of night to ask me that?" "I thought it a point that should be settled." "No reason why you should come jumping on my stomach." "No, there," Lancelot admitted, "I perhaps went a little too far. I am sorry for that." "Not half as sorry as I am. I was dreaming of rogue elephants, and I thought one of them had sat down on me. Do you know what I'd have done if you had played a trick like that on me in the old days in West Africa? I'd have shot you like a dog." "Really?" "I assure you, it is routine in West Africa." "Tell me about West Africa," said Lancelot, hoping to mollify. "To hell with West Africa," said the colonel. "Get out of here, and consider yourself fortunate that you aren't as full of holes as a colander." Lancelot left the room feeling somewhat despondent. During dinner and after it he had flattered himself that he had made a good impression on his host, but something seemed to tell him that he had now lost ground. And what, meanwhile, of Gladys Weatherby? Working on a sonnet next morning, she was conscious of a strange feeling of uneasiness and apprehension, which made it hard for her to get the lines the right length. Ever since she had seen Lancelot off on the train, she had been a prey to doubts and fears. She adored him with a passion which already had produced 6 sonnets, a ballade, and about 1/2 pound of vers libre. But all engaged girls have the poorest opinion of the intelligence of the men they are engaged to, and she had never wavered in her view that her loved one's IQ was about equal to that of a retarded child of 7. If there was a way of bungling everything down at Bittleton, he would, she was convinced, spring to the task. And it was only the fact that there seemed no way in which even he could bungle that had led her to entrust him with the mission which meant so much to them both. All he had to do was paint a portrait, and while painting it, exercise the charm she knew him to possess. And surely even Lancelot Bingley was capable of that. Nevertheless, she continued ill at ease, and it was with more anguish than surprise that she read the telegram which reached her shortly after lunch. It ran, "Drop everything and come to Bittleton immediately. Stop. Disaster stares eyeball, and your moral support sorely needed. Stop. Love and kisses. Stop. Lancelot." For some moments she stood congealed, her worst fears confirmed. Then, going to her bedroom, she packed a few necessaries in a suitcase and hailed a taxi. 20 minutes later she was on the train, a ticket to Bittleton in her bag, and an hour and 45 minutes after that she entered her uncle's garden. The first thing she saw there was Lancelot pacing up and down, his manner indistinguishable from that of a cat on hot bricks. He came tottering towards her. "Thank heaven you're here," he cried. "I need your woman's intelligence. Perhaps you can tell me what to do for the best. For the storm clouds are lowering. I seem to remember saying in my telegram that disaster stared me in the eyeball. That in no way overstated it. Let me tell you what's happened." Gladys was staring at him dumbly. She had been expecting the worst, and this was apparently what she was going to get. If she had had any tan, she would have paled beneath it. "Here, then, are the facts. I must begin by saying that last night I jumped on your uncle's stomach." "Jumped on his stomach?" whispered Gladys, finding speech. "Oh, purely inadvertently, but I could tell by his manner that he was annoyed. It was like this," said Lancelot, and he related briefly the events of the previous night. "But that wouldn't have mattered so much," he went on, "if it hadn't been for what happened this morning. I had sauntered out into the garden with my after-breakfast cigar." He paused. He thought he had heard a stepped-on cat utter a piercing yowl, but it was only Gladys commenting on what he had said. Her eyes, which, under the right conditions, could be so soft and loving, were shooting flames. "I told you were not to smoke." I know, but I thought it would be all right if no one saw me. One must have one's smoke after breakfast, or what are breakfasts for? Well, as I was saying, I sauntered out and lit up, and I hadn't puffed more than a few puffs when I heard voices. Oh, heavens! That, or something like it, was what I said, and I dived into the shrubbery. The voices came nearer. Someone was approaching, or rather, I should have said that 2 persons were approaching, for if there had been only 1 person approaching, he would hardly have been talking to himself. Though, of course, you do get that sort of thing in Shakespeare. Hamlet, to take but one instance, frequently soliloquized. "Lancelot! My angel? Get on with it." Certainly. Where was I? "You were smoking your cigar, which I had expressly forbidden you to do so, in the shrubbery." "No, there you are wrong. I was in the shrubbery, yes, but I was not smoking my cigar, and I'll tell you why. In my natural perturbation at hearing these voices and realizing that two persons were approaching, I had dropped it on the lawn." He paused again. Once again Gladys had uttered that eldritch scream, so like in its timbre to that of a domestic cat with a number 11 boot on its tail. "Lancelot Bingley, you ought to be in a padded cell." Yes, yes, but don't keep interrupting me, darling, or I shall lose the thread. Well, these two approaching persons had now drawn quite close to where I lurked beneath a laurel bush, and I was enabled to hear their conversation. One of them was your uncle, the other a globular woman whom I assumed to be the Mrs. Potter of whom I had heard so much, for she was sketching out the menu for to-night's dinner, which I don't mind telling you is going to be a pippin. Your uncle evidently thought so too, for he kept saying, "Excellent, excellent," and things like that, and my mouth was watering freely when all of a sudden a female shriek or cry rent the air, and peeping cautiously round my laurel bush, I saw that the Potter female was pointing in an aghast sort of way at something lying on the grass, and, to cut a long story short, it was my cigar. A dull despair weighed Gladys Weatherby down. "So they caught you," she said tonelessly. "No," said Lancelot. "I lurked unseen, and of course they didn't know it was my cigar. I gathered from their remarks that the prime suspects are the chauffeur and the gardener. It naturally didn't occur to your uncle to pin the rap on me, because after dinner last night I had convinced him that I was a total abstainer." Indignation brought a flush to Gladys's face. No girl likes to be dragged into the depths of the country on a hot afternoon by a telegram from her betrothed saying that disaster stares him in eyeball, when apparently disaster has been doing nothing of the sort. "Then what's all the fuss about?" she demanded. "Why the urgent SOSs? You're in the clear." Lancelot corrected her gently. "No, my loved one. In the soup, yes, but not in the clear. I don't understand you." "You will in about 2 seconds flat. I am sorry to have to add that on the advice of Mrs. Potter, your uncle is having the cigar finger-printed." "What?" "Yes, it appears that she has a brother or cousin or something at Scotland Yard, and she said that was always the first thing they did with a piece of evidence. Taking the dabs, I believe they call it. So your uncle said he could lock it in his desk till it could be examined by the proper experts, and he picked it up carefully with his handkerchief, like they do in books. So now you see why that telegram of mine expressed itself so strongly. My fingerprints must be all over the damn thing, and it won't take those experts 5 minutes to lay the crime at my door." An expletive which she had picked up at the Poets' Club in Bloomsbury burst from Gladys's lips. She clutched her brow. "Don't talk," she said. "I want to think." She stood motionless, her brain plainly working at its maximum speed. A fly settled on her left eyebrow, but she ignored it. Lancelot watched her anxiously. "Anything stirring?" he asked. Gladys came out of her reverie. "Yes," she said, and her voice had lost its dull despondency. "I see what to do. We must sneak down tonight, when everyone's in bed, and retrieve that cigar. I know where to find a duplicate key to Uncle Francis's desk. I used it a lot in my childhood when he kept chocolate there. Expect me at your bedroom door at about midnight, and we'll get cracking." "You think we can do it?" "It'll be as easy as falling off a log," said Gladys. All artists are nervous, highly strung men, and Lancelot, as he waited for the girl he loved to come and tell him that 0 hour had arrived, was not at his most debonair and carefree. The thought of the impending expedition had the worst effect on his morale. It so happened that for one reason or another he had never fallen off a log, but he assumed it to be a feat well within the scope of the least gifted, and why Gladys should think it resembled the hideous task that lay before them he could not imagine. He could tot up a dozen things which could go wrong. Suppose, to take an instance at random, the parrot overheard them and roused the house. But when Gladys did appear, something of confidence returned to him. The mere look of her was encouraging. There is nothing that so heartens a man in a crisis as the feeling that he has a woman of strong executive qualities at his side. Macbeth, it will be remembered, had this experience. "Shh," said Gladys, though he had not spoken, and before they set out she had a word of advice on strategy and tactics to impart. "Now listen, Lancelot," she said. "We want to conduct this operation with a minimum of sound effects. Your impulse, I know, will be to trip over your feet and fall downstairs with a noise like the delivery of a ton of coal. But resist it. Play the scene quietly. Okay? Right. Then let's go." Nothing marred the success of the expedition from the outset. True, Lancelot tripped over his feet as anticipated, but a quick snatch at the banister enabled him to avoid giving the impersonation of the delivery of a ton of coals against which he had warned him. In silence they descended the stairs and stole noiselessly into the study. Gladys produced her duplicate key, and Lancelot was just saying to himself that if he were a bookie he would estimate the odds on the happy ending as at least 4-1, when there occurred one of those unforeseen hitches which cannot be budgeted for. Even as Gladys, key in hand, approached the desk, there came from outside the sound of stealthy footsteps, and it was only too evident that their objective was the study in which they were trapped. It was a moment fraught with embarrassment for the young couple, but each acted with a promptitude deserving of the highest praise. By the time the door opened, no evidence of their presence was discernible. Gladys was concealed behind the curtains that draped the French windows, while Lancelot, having cleared the desk with a lissom bound, was crouching behind it, doing his best not to breathe. The first sound he heard, after the opening of the door, was the click of key in a lock. It was followed by the scratching of a match, and suddenly there floated to his nostrils the unmistakable scent of cigar smoke. And even as he sought faintly for a solution of this mystery, the curtains parted with a rattle, and he was able to catch a glimpse of the upper portions of his betrothed. She was staring accusingly down at something beyond his range of vision, and when a sharp exclamation in Swahili broke the silence, he knew that this must be Colonel Pashley Drake. "So," said Gladys. There are not many good things one can say in answer to the word "so," especially if one is called upon to find one at a moment's notice, and the Colonel remained silent for a space. It was only when Gladys had repeated the word that he spoke. My dear," he said, "there you are. Sorry to have seemed a bit taciturn, but your abrupt appearance surprised me. I thought you were in bed and asleep. Well, no doubt it seems odd to you to find me here, but I can explain, and you will see how I am situated." "You are situated in an armchair with a whacking great cigar in your mouth, and I shall be glad to have the inside story." "You shall have it at once, and I think it will touch your heart. You were away from home, I believe, when Mrs. Potter entered my service." "She had been here a year when I first saw her." "So I thought. She was in the employment of a friend of mine when I was introduced to her superlative cooking. When he conked out, Apoplexy, poor fellow, brought on, I have always felt, by overindulgence in her steak and kidney pies. I immediately asked her to come to me, and I was stunned when she inquired if I was a non-smoker, adding that she held smoking to be the primary cause of all human ills, and would never consider serving under the banner of an employer who indulged in the revolting practice. You follow me so far? I get the picture. It was a tricky situation, you will admit. On the one hand, I loved cigars. On the other, I adored good food. Which to choose? The whole of that night I lay sleepless on my bed, pondering, and when morning came, I knew what my decision must be. I made the great sacrifice. I told her I never smoked, and until tonight I never have. But this morning the chauffeur or somebody dropped the cigar on the lawn, and the sight of it shook me to my depths. I had not seen one for 3 years, and all the old craving returned. Unable to resist the urge, I crept down here, and, well, that is the story, my dear, and I am sure you will not let this little lapse of mine come to Mrs. Potter's ears. I can rely on you? Of course. Thank you, thank you. You have taken a great weight off my mind. Bless my soul, I haven't felt so relieved since the afternoon in West Africa, when a rhinoceros, charging on me with flashing eyes, suddenly sprained an ankle and had to call the whole thing off. I shudder to think what would have happened if Mrs. Potter had learned of my doings this night. She would have been off like a jackrabbit, and I wouldn't have been able to see her for dust. She would have vanished like a dream at daybreak. But provided you seal your lips. Oh, I'll seal them. Thank you, my dear. I knew I could rely on you. And you, on your side, will write me a cheque for that bit of cash of mine. You see, I want to get married. You do? Who to? You know him, Lancelot Bingley. A hoarse exclamation in some little-known Senegambian dialect burst from the Colonel's lips. You mean that artist fellow? That's right. You're joking. I'm not. You mean you seriously intend to marry that pop-eyed young slab of damnation? He is not pop-eyed. But you will concede that he is a slab of damnation. I will do nothing of the sort. Lancelot is a bar-lamb. A bar-lamb? Yes, a bar-lamb. Well, he doesn't look to me like a bar-lamb, more like something the cat brought in, and not a very fastidious cat at that. In his nook behind the desk, Lancelot flushed hotly. For a moment he thought of rising to his feet with a curt, "I resent that remark," but prudence told him it was better not to interrupt. "And it is not only his looks I object to," continued the Colonel. "I suppose he has kept it from you, but he goes about jumping on people's stomachs." "Yes, he mentioned that to me." "Well, then, you don't expect me to abet you in your crazy scheme of marrying a chap like that? I won't give you a penny." "Then I'll tell Mrs. Potter you're a secret smoker." The Colonel gasped. The cigar fell from his hand. He picked it up, dusted it, and returned it to his lips. His voice, when he spoke, was hoarse and trembled. This is blackmail." "With the possible exception of diamonds," said Gladys. "A girl's best friend." Silence fell. The Colonel's eyes were strained and bleak. His chins vibrated. It was plain that he was engaged in serious thought, but the clash of wills could have but one ending. "Very well," he said at length. "I consent. I do it with the utmost reluctance for the idea of you marrying that, how shall I describe him? Well, never mind. You know what I mean. Chills me to the marrow. But I have no alternative. I cannot do without Mrs. Potter's cooking. You shall have it. And furthermore, said Lancelot, shooting up from behind the desk and causing the Colonel to quiver like a smitten jelly, you shall have all the cigars you want. I have a box of 50, or rather 49, upstairs in my room, and I give them to you freely. And after breakfast tomorrow I will show you a spot in the shrubbery where you can smoke your head off without fear of detection. The Colonel drew a deep breath. His eyes glowed with a strange light. His chins vibrated again, but this time with ecstasy. He said a few words in Cape Dutch, then, seeing that his companions had missed the gist, he obligingly translated. "Gladys," he said, "I could wish you no better husband. He is, as you were telling me, one of the Baalams, and in my opinion, by no means the worst of them. I think you will be very happy." And that was A Good Cigar is a Smoke, read by Nick Martin.